Welcome to the debate, Friction to Magic. Can scientific conflict create lasting love? Today we analyze the ideas from the book The Alchemy of Connection. Imagine you and your partner are having the exact same explosive fight about money or family or household chores for the 100th time.
Oh, we've all been there. The tension is just suffocating.
Exactly. But what if the person standing across from you, the person you are so furiously pointing a finger at, isn't actually your partner at all, but, well, a ghost from their childhood?
That is the core question we are looking at today. Navigating relationship conflict and transforming those entrenched patterns of friction into deep, lasting intimacy is, frankly, one of our most profound life challenges.
It really is. And the premise we're examining is that the enemies destroying our relationships are rarely our partners. Rather, they're our own unmet needs, early attachment blueprints, and our poor communication habits.
Right. So let's start by laying out our perspectives. I will readily concede that the psychological insights underpinning these proposals are undeniably fascinating. The deep dive into how childhood shapes adult intimacy is profound.
But you have some reservations.
I do. My position is that the rigid application of these highly structured methods is often totally unrealistic in the heat of actual messy human conflict. We have to critically examine the real-world viability of demanding that emotionally triggered individuals act like perfect therapists.
Even when their nervous systems are screaming in fight-or-flight mode?
Furthermore, there is a genuine, heavily under-discussed risk here. Treating all conflict as an internal projection runs the very dangerous risk of invalidating legitimate, objective external grievances. If someone is genuinely mistreating you, looking inward can border on self-gaslighting.
I completely understand the hesitation around feeling overly clinical. I really do. However, I take the position that this framework, decoding attachment styles, and using structured communication is a highly practical, deeply transformative roadmap.
A roadmap for building resilient love, as the argument goes.
Right. Because we are so accustomed to treating relationship friction like a broken bone. We find the external fracture, point to it, and say, fix that. But human intimacy just doesn't work that way.
Because of these shadow scrolls, right?
Yes. The friction usually originates from deeply ingrained subconscious blueprints drafted in our earliest years. They dictate how we perceive safety and connection. When we shift our perspective from an external battle to an internal exploration, we stop treating the superficial symptoms.
By superficial symptoms, you mean arguing over who loaded the dishwasher.
Exactly. We stop treating that and we start curing the underlying relational disease. By understanding the neurological mechanisms of attachment, we bypass the ego's outdated defense mechanisms. It's a profound paradigm shift that removes blame and fosters radical empathy.
Okay, let's test that paradigm shift directly. Let's focus on this idea of the internal enemy, because it really is the grand revelation of this entire approach.
I agree. The proposition is that perceived adversaries in a relationship are actually projections of our own unaddressed histories. When couples fight, they rarely fight about the tangible facts of the present moment.
They are battling internal adversaries, right? Fear of vulnerability, the inner critic, unresolved traumas.
Exactly. Let's make this concrete and raise the stakes beyond just washing the dishes. Imagine a couple locked in a perpetual, vicious fight because one partner consistently prioritizes their career over the relationship.
Okay, working late, missing major milestones, a very common, high-stress, real-world scenario.
Right. The traditional approach is to argue the schedule. You demand more time. But arguing the calendar never solves the friction because the calendar isn't the actual problem here.
So what is the underlying reality, according to this proposal?
The partner who is furious about the late nights might be projecting a childhood marked by profound emotional abandonment. Their core unmet need is safety and reassurance. On the other side, the partner who is overworking is acting out a desperate bid for validation.
Driven by a history of hypercritical parents, maybe? Where love was entirely conditional on achievement?
Exactly. Their unmet need is to feel inherently worthy. Once they stop pointing fingers at the external behavior and look at the internal projection, the enemy dynamic dissolves entirely. It is replaced by a mutual understanding of why those specific triggers hurt so much.
I mean, I see the elegance in that logic. It certainly softens the immediate anger to realize your partner isn't intentionally trying to abandon you.
Right. They are just trying to prove their worth to a ghost.
Sure, but I have a fundamental problem with applying this as a universal standard. In a controlled, hypothetical environment, it sounds beautiful. But in the real world, is this actually realistic, or does it risk a dangerous level of self-gaslighting?
How do you mean?
Well, what happens when the behavior isn't just working late? We're talking about common relational adversaries like the wall builder who stonewalls and uses the silent treatment to punish.
Or the accuser who relies on gaslighting and counterattacking.
Right. These aren't just innocent expressions of unmet needs. These are deeply toxic, sometimes emotionally abusive behaviors. If my partner is actively gaslighting me, twisting my words, and I am instructed to pause and look inward,
To ask what unmet need within you is being triggered?
yes, if I do that, I am actively internalizing their toxic behavior. You risk trapping people in dynamics where they assume the blame for their partner's complete lack of emotional regulation.
I am really glad you brought that up, because I actually struggled with that exact concept myself. It's a very sharp edge to walk. But the proposal isn't advocating for the passive acceptance of mistreatment.
It sure sounds like it sometimes.
Finding empathy for the root cause of a behavior is fundamentally not the same thing as tolerating the behavior. Taking personal responsibility for your own reactions doesn't absolve the partner of their actions. What it does do is grant you profound personal agency.
Agency to do what exactly? Understand exactly why I'm being mistreated?
Agency to break the cycle of the fight. When confronted with an accuser, if you react defensively, your nervous system is hijacked. You are immediately caught in their storm, fighting on their terms.
Okay, so how does looking inward change that?
If you can observe your own internal trigger, say, noticing that your chest is tightening because this mirrors how an older sibling used to dominate you, you can actively regulate your own biology.
So I'm just calming myself down while they yell?
You aren't excusing the gaslighting. You are disarming its physical effect on your nervous system. You do that so you can set a firm boundary from a place of cold, clear clarity, rather than a place of wounded, chaotic reactivity.
But setting a boundary still requires acknowledging that the external behavior is objectively unacceptable. If the fundamental philosophy is that the enemy was never who you thought, it inherently softens the boundary against objective mistreatment.
I don't think it softens the boundary. It just changes how you enforce it.
It shifts the heavy labor onto the victim of the poor behavior to perform cognitive gymnastics. And honestly, if I'm supposed to be doing this deep internal forensic work while my partner is actively stonewalling me, I need to know where these projections are supposedly coming from.
Well, they come directly from what we mentioned earlier, our early childhood attachment blueprints.
The shadow scrolls. Right now, it just feels like assigning blame to invisible forces.
And to truly understand this, we have to explain the why and the how of the human nervous system. The diagnostic efficiency of understanding these blueprints is really unparalleled. We are talking about core physiological programming.
So practically speaking, what does that look like?
Broadly speaking, let's look at two major styles that often end up together: anxious preoccupied and dismissive avoidant.
Let's define those clearly step by step. They get thrown around on social media a lot without any real context.
Absolutely. Let's explain it simply. If you are anxious preoccupied, your early caregivers were likely inconsistent. Sometimes they were warm and loving, sometimes they were physically or emotionally unavailable.
So you never knew what you were going to get.
Exactly. Because of that inconsistency, your developing nervous system learned that connection is incredibly fragile and requires constant vigilance. As an adult, you crave high levels of intimacy and are utterly terrified of abandonment.
Okay, and the dismissive avoidant.
On the flip side, if someone is dismissive avoidant, their caregivers were likely emotionally unavailable or dismissive of their needs entirely. Their nervous system learned that relying on others is dangerous and inevitably leads to disappointment.
So they just shut down.
Right. To survive, they learn to suppress their emotions and value fierce independence, especially under stress.
So when a major conflict happens, these two divergent biological survival strategies essentially collide head-on.
Exactly. During a fight, the avoidant partner's nervous system detects the threat, So their biological imperative is to withdraw. They pull away to regulate their heart rate and will calm down.
But that exact withdrawal triggers the anxious partner's deepest fear, right? That primal fear of abandonment.
The brilliance of the framework is this. If they have diagnosed these blueprints, the anxious partner understands that the withdrawal is not a rejection of them personally. It is a deep-seated neurological need for autonomy.
So they don't chase after them.
Right. Instead of taking it personally and escalating the conflict by screaming for attention, they can self-soothe and offer space.
Look, I hear the underlying logic, but does this actually work in the long run, or does it just give us academic-sounding excuses for bad behavior?
Why would it be an excuse?
You mentioned diagnostic efficiency, but I look at this and see clinical horoscopes.
Clinical horoscopes? Seriously?
Yes. It's where people read a description, say, oh, that's me, and then use it to justify all their flaws. Let me give you another style to prove my point. The fearful avoidant blueprint.
Okay, let's look at that one.
From what I understand, this is formed by trauma, where the caregiver was actually a source of fear. So the person desperately wants connection, but is terrified of it. It results in highly unpredictable push and pull behavior.
Which can be very difficult to navigate.
It's terrifying for a partner to endure. Sudden explosions of anger, followed by completely freezing up. Does slapping the diagnostic label of fearful avoidant on that person suddenly justify their behavior?
Of course not. It doesn't justify it.
Well, people use it that way. I'm sorry I screamed, broke a plate and walked out, but my caregivers were frightening, so my fearful avoidant blueprint was activated. We risk arming people with psychological jargon that they use as an absolute shield against accountability.
It is absolutely not a shield. It is a roadmap for conscious change. The framework is very clear. You identify these patterns to transform them, not to rest on them. Knowing your blueprint allows you to observe the pattern in real time.
So you just watch yourself be toxic?
No, you name the feeling to tame it. You recognize, I am pulling away and acting destructively right now, not because my partner is awful, but because my nervous system is mistakenly perceiving a life or death threat.
Okay.
It takes the conflict out of the realm of mysterious, irreconcilable personality clashes and turns it into a solvable psychological mechanism.
Okay, let's put that solvable mechanism to the ultimate test. Let's assume I fully buy into this. I understand my partner's nervous system is flooded. I know they have an avoidant attachment style.
Right, you have the diagnostic understanding.
But understanding the theory in a vacuum doesn't stop the bleeding in the moment. Suppose we have a massive, high-stakes conflict. Let's say my partner unilaterally invites their parents to stay in our small apartment for 2 full weeks without consulting me at all.
Wow, okay, high stakes indeed.
My blood is boiling, my own boundaries have been completely obliterated. What exactly does this framework expect me to do in that precise moment? Does it expect me to just sit in Zen-like silence because I know they're just acting out a childhood pattern?
Not at all. That's exactly where the transition from psychological understanding to active execution happens. This relies heavily on structured communication. Specifically, tools like nonviolent communication, or NVC.
NVC. Right.
Think of it less like a conversation and more like speaking the operating system language of the human nervous system.
The operating system language. I mean, I'm intrigued by that metaphor. How exactly does it work?
Well, think about a computer. When a computer is throwing an error code, screaming at the monitor does absolutely nothing. You have to input the exact string of code to bypass the firewall and get the system working again.
And NVC is the code?
Yes. It's a highly effective 4-pillar ritual. Observation, feeling, need, and request. You state factual actions without judgment, identify your physical emotion, connect it to a universal human need, and make a clear, actionable request.
Walk me through exactly how I use that code when the in-laws are arriving tomorrow and I'm absolutely furious.
If you yell, "You are so unbelievably selfish and controlling for inviting your parents without asking me," you trigger their ego's firewall. They will immediately counterattack to defend themselves and nothing gets resolved.
Okay, so what is the code instead?
Instead, you input the code, observation. When I learned that your parents are coming to stay for 2 weeks without us discussing it first, feeling. I felt incredibly overwhelmed and sidelined.
Okay.
Need. Because I have a deep need for partnership and autonomy in our shared sanctuary. Request: would you be willing to call them today, shorten the trip to 3 days, and agree we always consult each other on overnight guests? You bypass their threat detection system entirely.
I have to stop you there because we need to ask, is it realistic to expect human beings to speak like therapists during a major life conflict? Imagine the physical tension in the room. You are furious.
It is definitely hard in the moment.
Your amygdala is firing, your heart rate is elevated, and you are supposed to suppress all of that natural evolutionary drive to express your anger and instead recite a 4-step incantation?
It's not an incantation, it's a structure.
When I observe X, I feel Y because I need Z. It feels incredibly robotic. Frankly, it can feel manipulative.
Manipulative? I hear that critique a lot, actually. But how is stating your needs clearly and without blaming the other person manipulative?
Because it sanitizes the reality of the emotion. Anger has a biological purpose. Frustration communicates the severity of a boundary troughing.
But unchecked anger just creates more friction.
When you force people to filter their raw, authentic reactions through a clinical template, you drain the actual passion out of the dynamic. You're asking people to put on a mask of perfect emotional regulation. I'd argue that true intimacy is built on trusting your partner enough to be messy.
Messy is fine, but destructive isn't.
But to be visibly angry, to be imperfect, without the whole relationship shattering. If we can only communicate our deepest grievances through highly structured, sterilized I statements, are we actually intimate? Or are we just effectively managing a hostage negotiation?
You're right that NVC does feel unnatural and rigid at first. I completely concede that it feels like learning a clunky script. But let me challenge the idea that structure suppresses authenticity.
How could it not?
I'd argue the exact opposite. Structure creates the safe container for authenticity. Unfiltered rage might feel authentic to you in the moment, but we just established what happens next. It triggers the other person's avoidant or anxious defenses.
And then the fight just spirals.
Exactly. Then nobody is hearing anything. The connection is completely severed. By focusing on I feel and identifying a universal human need like the need to feel valued, you actually invite your partner to see your vulnerability.
Assuming they're in a place to receive it.
Right. But you cannot be intimate if your partner's nervous system is convinced it is under a physical attack. The structure is the tool that keeps the shields down so the actual human connection can happen.
That assumes the partner is acting in good faith and is ready to receive that perfectly packaged vulnerability. But, all right, let's assume it works. Let's assume we navigate the incident with the in-laws using these tools.
Retain our internal dragons, we input the nervous system code.
We survive the fight. What then? Does this hypervigilance ever stop?
It evolves into long-term maintenance, sustaining the magic. And that requires immense intentionality. The proposal champions the use of scheduled relational check-ins.
Scheduled check-ins, like a meeting?
This isn't just casually asking how was your day over dinner. It is a deliberate, structured weekly practice where you set the stage, open with gratitude, share your internal landscape, address emerging challenges, and reaffirm the connection.
It sounds like a lot of work into relationship maintenance.
Well, CBT is all about challenging distorted thought patterns. For example, if your partner is quiet one evening, your anxious brain might immediately panic and say, "Oh, they are losing interest in me, they are pulling away."
Right, jumping to the worst-case scenario.
CBT teaches you to pause, examine the actual evidence, and replace that distortion with a balanced perspective. They had a grueling day at work and are just tired. It has nothing to do with me. Treating the relationship with this level of intentional, scheduled maintenance builds a robust emotional reservoir.
So you're catching resentments early.
Yes, it prevents small, unspoken frictions from calcifying into deep, deep resentments.
I agree entirely that unspoken resentments are poison to a relationship, but I have to push back on the sheer scale of what is being asked of people here. What happens to the magic of romance when we schedule it into a calendar invite with success metrics?
Success metrics.
Yes! This is the corporatization of love. We are turning a love story into a corporate board meeting. Step 1, open with positive feedback. Step 2, list actionable challenges. Step 3, commit to a resolution metric.
It doesn't have to be that rigid.
But it is incredibly sterile. Over-intellectualizing intimacy and constantly tracking our emotional metrics really risks killing the very spontaneity that makes long-term romance worthwhile in the first place.
I completely understand the fear of losing the romance, and it is a valid concern. But let's look at the reality of long-term partnership. Spontaneity is wonderful for a 6-month honeymoon phase.
It's pretty great, yeah.
It is. But it is a terrible, unreliable strategy for maintaining a 50-year partnership through mortgages, illness, and raising children. You don't rely on spontaneity to keep your car's engine from exploding. You rely on scheduled, routine maintenance.
But a car isn't a car.
The idea that romance should just naturally sustain itself without structured effort is a pervasive cultural myth, and frankly, it leads to incredibly high divorce rates.
But a car is a machine with predictable engineered parts. Human beings are fundamentally irrational, constantly evolving, and deeply contradictory. If we rely too heavily on these structured methodologies, we might trick ourselves into believing we have solved our partner.
Solved them?
Yes, reducing their complex humanity into a set of predictable psychological triggers. Oh, there goes my partner's fearful avoidant response again. I'll just apply Protocol 4. It can foster a subtle academic condescension.
That's definitely a cynical way to look at it.
And I worry about the exhaustion factor. If I have to constantly monitor my attachment style, reframe my cognitive distortions with CBT, perfectly sequence my NVC requests, and show up to my weekly relational performance review, when do I just get to exist?
You're overstating the burden.
When do I just get to be with my partner without analyzing the interaction?
You get to exist deeply and peacefully in the spaces between. The vigilance isn't meant to be a permanent state of exhausting high alert. It's meant to build a new baseline of habit. Think of it like learning a complex new language.
Okay, sure.
At first, translating every single sentence in your head before you speak is grueling. It is exhausting. But eventually, the grammar and syntax become second nature, and you achieve fluency. You stop thinking about the rules.
So the structure just fades into the background.
Yes, the structured communication, the awareness of the shadow scrolls, these are the grammar rules of intimacy. Once mastered, they operate in the background. It allows for a much deeper, much more relaxed state of being, because the foundational architecture of the relationship is finally secure.
Well, fluency is a beautiful goal. But as we look at this entire proposal, my skepticism remains rooted in the demand for perfection. Humans will fail at this fluency.
Of course they will.
They will yell instead of using I statements. The real test of lasting love isn't whether you can flawlessly execute a psychological framework. It's whether the bond can survive the moments when the framework completely falls apart.
And I don't think the methods demand perfection at all. In fact, they emphasize repair and forgiveness as a crucial practice, precisely because we will inevitably drop the ball. Let's summarize where we stand.
Sure.
My position is that despite the immense effort required, we cannot rely on instinct alone to navigate complex human bonds. Utilizing structured communication, decoding our deep-seated attachment styles, and taking radical personal responsibility are essential, transformative tools.
Tools to turn friction into magic, right?
Exactly. They reliably turn the friction of two colliding lives into a workable, magical connection.
And my position is that while the psychological self-reflection encouraged here is deeply valuable, listeners must be extremely wary of over-intellectualizing love. There is a real danger in suppressing natural emotional rawness to fit a clinical script.
And the risk of self-gaslighting.
Yes. We must be vigilant against using psychological frameworks to invalidate objective relationship problems or excuse unacceptable behavior.
It really comes down to whether you view the alchemy of connection as a practical, must-try blueprint for saving a relationship or a methodology that should be approached with caution.
Exactly. You don't want your romance to become an exhausting exercise in conflict management. The diagnostic landscape of love is murky. These tools ask us to turn the lens inward first, to examine our own fractures before pointing the finger.
Right.
Whether that introspection leads to profound healing or an endless cycle of self-analysis is up to how carefully you wield those tools. We leave it to you to decide how to apply these methods in your own lives.
Until next time, consider this. If the enemy you've been fighting in your relationship is actually just a ghost from the past, what happens to your connection when you finally decide to put the armor down?